Good evening. I'm being told that the live stream has already started, and so we should get started. How are you guys doing tonight? Good. Welcome to Google. Welcome to the Angular Mountain View meetup. We're excited to have you guys here. So I'll just do some quick announcements, and then we'll get things rolling for real here. So one of the teams within Google wanted me to announce that we've actually hired a few people from this meetup, actually. So Google is always hiring fantastic Angular developers. So what we'll do is I'm going to go and try and get a post, the specific job posting they're looking for, and I'll put it in this meetup. So if you're interested in a job at Google doing Angular, sounds like fun. I would do that. We will try and put that in the group here. Next meetup is going to be November 9th, I believe. Kara Erickson, who we're all big fans of, is going to talk about forms. So if you've ever seen her do any of her live coding, she is fantastic and amazing. There's a mini Angular update for you guys. So as of today, we are following the release process and policy that we talked about both at our 2.0 announcement and in kind of blog posts and things since then. So we announced today we released Angular 2.1 to NPM. This is a very, very minor release, but has a couple cool new features. One is eager lazy loading or optimistic preloading of lazy loaded ng modules. And then the other one is some aliases that help if anyone's doing any sort of animations. This is a drop-in release, so it should be very easy, no breaking changes. And I think you're all going to like it a lot. The MTV Go shuttle to Caltrain leaves at about 8:13. So even though this event is scheduled to go to about 9, some of you may have to leave. I believe Keith has kind of split it up into a couple different sections. So there will be a natural stopping point if anybody has to leave early. With that, I want to introduce Keith here. Keith is a partner technology manager at Google. He actually runs a lot of the internal training for Googlers on Angular too. So he knows a ton about Angular. He's a fantastic resource. He's also training for a triathlon right now. So starting off with a short one, but hoping to make his way up to an Ironman. This is especially hard for him because he hates running, which is normally this training actually takes 2 full days. So much like his triathlon training, he's trying to squish it in. So he's boiled it down into this little 2-hour session for us. And we even played a trick on him. So I mentioned that we announced Angular 2.1 today. In all of his code samples, he refers to the latest version of Angular. So we updated it. He didn't even know, and everything kept working. So that was a pretty good sign for no breaking changes. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Keith.
Hello. Well, thanks for that introduction. And again, welcome to all of you to Mountain View and to join us on this occasion. So I'm going to log in real quick and then start presenting. So as Steven said, this is basically a condensed version of the training we offer internally to Googlers. And what's cool about this is that there is also a companion code lab, and I believe a few of you may have seen some rumors about that in the meetup. So after this, we'll post links to the deck, and then inside the deck, we have the links to plunkers and so forth so that you can follow along. So with that, let me go ahead and present. All right, got it, great. Okay, so today you're going to learn how to build an Angular 2 app. Who has tried Angular 2 already? Show of hands. Wow, a lot of you, awesome. Have you tried the tutorial online showing like the heroes and so forth? Yes? Okay, so let's give you a slightly different view. We'll cover some things in more detail, other things in less detail, but overall it should help you get a more general understanding of Angular and how things work. Mostly this will be high level. We'll go pretty quickly. Some things we'll get very detailed on to help explain the concepts better. But overall, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, ask. I'll do my best to answer. If we're taking a lot longer than expected, then I'll just ask you to hold your question to the end. We can talk afterwards or just post in the meetup, and then we'll do Q&A on there after the fact. Sound good? Who's excited? All right, let's do it. So I guess I don't really have to introduce Angular because all of you know it. But real quickly, you may be familiar, Angular is a development platform that helps you extend HTML syntax and eliminate much of the code that you normally have to write when building rich web applications. The Angular 2 platform offers a lot of benefits. You may have seen a very similar slide in I/O this year. And we're going to focus on just a few pieces here. Highly encourage you to check out angular.io for more information and to get a deeper dive into all of these concepts. Another thing that we're going to talk about here is TypeScript. So there's another version, Dart, that you could also use, but we're going to cover TypeScript here. I like it better personally. This is kind of a simple diagram to understand what TypeScript is in relation to JavaScript or ECMAScript. You can see here that TypeScript has some extra goodies on top of ES5 and ES6, like decorators and types. But ultimately, you'll be transpiling down into ES5 for supporting the majority of the browsers out there. And if you want to play around with TypeScript and you haven't already, there's a playground available at typescriptlang.org/play. So try that out. It's pretty cool. All right, so what are we going to build today? This is a simple YouTube app that will let you load up a list of cat videos. You can vote on them up and down. Don't know what that was. This does not actually interact with the YouTube service. We don't have any API keys you're going to play with, but lets you load up a list of videos, toggle between descriptions and stats. You get some extra details like learn about the cats or turn up your speakers, side descriptions that our app is providing that is not provided by the YouTube service. And then you can also toggle between playing the embedded videos and not. All right. So the other thing we're going to introduce is the router. And here you can see a simple upload form. And along with that, we'll have some simple validation. So in this case, we have a required title. And then, oh, that's fun. Ignore that. There we go. And then a description that requires that cats be posted. And again, you'll be building this yourself. There's a codelab homework assignment for you that starts off at the most basic level. And then as we go through different milestones, you'll be building up to get to this full app at the very end. Does that make sense? All right, great. So here is that link to the homework assignment. I don't recommend you do it right now because this is really jam-packed full of content, but I'm going to go over very quickly how it looks and what you'll be doing, okay? So let me pull up my version real fast. Nope, that's the solution. One moment. There we go. Okay. So in your version, which will hopefully not be laggy, you will have a simple HTML file. This will look different if you're building with CLI or other methods, but this will work for the purpose of this code lab. The majority of your work will be done in all of these files on the left-hand side. And what we've done is provided to-dos for you. So for instance, if we go to our main.ts, we can see here on line 9 and line 12 that there's a to-do M1. So M1 means milestone 1. So this course is broken up into 12 milestones or sections. So for each section, you'll go through and then update the code. And as you go through each milestone, things will hopefully build at the end of each milestone if you did it correctly. And then you'll be able to move on to the next section. So don't do milestone 2 to-dos before you've done milestone 1 because it will not work. You have to go sequentially. Okay? So let's file another file real fast. Here you can see another one. Here's an M1 with M11 later on. So just make sure you go in order. It should make sense. There are hints in the slides that'll hopefully help you out. And then, of course, just scan the code for to-dos. If you don't want to do your code editing in Plunker, then you can just download it to your computer and code in VS Code, Sublime, whatever you're used to. OK? Any questions here? It's OK. Don't be shy. OK, great. And again, I have a solution at the end of the deck. So if you want to like compare how you're doing with the solution guide, then feel free to do so. Not cheating. All right, great. All right, so let's dive in. I'm not going to go through and read off the agenda, but this is what we're going to be going through today. And we're going to start off with Bootstrap the application. That's the very first step when you're creating an Angular app. So let's talk about how you compose an Angular app first. So if you read the docs line, you may be familiar with this, but this is still somewhat a new concept for Angular, and that is modules. So if you think about Angular as a tree of components, each one of these dots could be a component, then you can think about each color as a module. So you're composing your app using this tree-like hierarchy, okay? So here you can see that the yellow circles are in module A, these two components, and then the purple components are in module B. Clear so far? All right. So let's get a little bit deeper. How do we actually make a component? So here is all the code required to make one of those circles, essentially, a component. So here you can see we're importing the component from Angular core. And then we use this new TypeScript decorator for component. And in that, we have to provide a selector and a template. That is the requirement for a component to work. And then you also provide a class. So in this case, we're calling it Hello World component to adhere to the style guide that we published. And all this together, when compiled, renders one component. Any questions so far? So we're doing away with the idea of controllers and views and all of that from Angular 1 in favor of this. Okay, good so far? All right, thank you. So let's take a little bit further. So we can also use relative imports. So in this case, we have another component, same definition at the top, but here we see that we're using a template URL to reference another file. So instead of having an inline template, we're referencing another file on our path. To make this work with relative paths, you have to provide this special module ID property on the component decorator. And then there's also the special keyword module.id that makes it work. Okay? Otherwise, this is the exact same. If we toggle between the two, we can see instead of having an inline template, we're just providing a path to a template file. Okay? Any questions here? I'll let you digest, make sure it makes sense, and then we'll move on. Yes? So the question was, why is module ID required? That's a great question. It has to do with how the compilation is happening behind the scenes. Now, hopefully, they'll be able to move away from that in the future. But for now, if you want to do relative paths, you need module ID, and it just kind of works automatically for you. Now, if you don't want to provide that, it doesn't make sense to you or whatever, you can use absolute paths. So like app/helloworld.html or something like that. That's perfectly acceptable too. And then, of course, inline templates will still work. Cool. Good question. Yes?
You have to import module or global variable?
Global variable. You don't have to import it. And I've done my best in these slides to show everything you have to import. So if you don't see it there, it probably isn't required. Cool. Yes?
So in the previous slide, you had these modules that you created, module A and B, which had the yellow and the purple.
Yes.
Does the module ID kind of map to one of these, or is it separate?
So the question was, in this slide, we have module A and module B. Does the module that we list here map to that? No. It's a little confusing, I understand. But no, it's not directly. Like, you don't call this module module A, or for instance. This is literally how you write it. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? We will post the deck to the meetup group afterwards. Yes. Okay, great. Let's oh, one more. I'll show you in a moment. All right, so here it is. This is where you actually make the relation to the modules we talked about earlier. So in this case, we're importing ng module from the Angular core library. And then here we have the ng module decorator. So in this, we can see we're providing decorators. So in this case, we're loading the hello world component we defined on the last slide. And then we're also bootstrapping it, sending the root components for application. And then finally, we're using the convention app module to declare the root app module. So in this case, it would be like module A you saw earlier. Does that make sense? Awesome. All right. So the last bit here is setting up our main.ts file. So this is what actually lets us show the application in the browser. So here, I'm not going to read all the code, but essentially we are bootstrapping the app using the bootstrap module function. And then in our index.html file, we just provide the component as we define it. So earlier, we have this selector here called hello-world, right? To use that in our template, you can see it looks like just any other normal HTML tag. Here it's hello world. And then once everything's bootstrapped and loaded, then your app will render instead of loading. Pretty easy, right? Any questions here? Awesome. I'll give you guys a few seconds to digest, make sure it all makes sense. Yes, question?
So the initial part of the slide, put the platform, browser, dynamic module.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain that?
How do you mean?
Like what it's doing. That's loaded for how.
So the question was, what's the underlying process behind bootstrapping the application? That's out of scope for this class. It's a great question. That should be documented online, though. So you check the Angular.io docs. It should detail how that works in more detail, but kind of out of scope for building an application right now. Okay, great. Good question, though. Any other questions? All right. So another thing we want to talk about is maybe you want to use another module, or maybe you're using the material library, the new Angular 2 material library that's in alpha right now, right? So if you want to import someone else's module and use it in yours, you do it like this. So on the left-hand side, we can imagine a third-party library. In this case, I'm putting it in the vendor folder, and this is just a simple carousel component. And here it looks like we just saw in the last slide. They have their own ng module, they declare their component, they export it, and now we want to continue. We want to use it in our app. So on the right-hand side, we see our app.module.ts file. And in this case, we can see that we're importing the carousel module. There's that new line, that new property. And then from then on, it's the same. We're still declaring our hello world component, and we're bootstrapping our hello world component. But now, the carousel module is available in our application at that module's level. And you'll see this in the code lab as well when we're importing the new Angular module, or Angular material library. This part's a little confusing sometimes, so it's okay if there's questions. Don't be embarrassed. Yes, back there.
There's no requirement into the
There is, that is a typo. I thought I got them all, but I guess I missed one. Yeah, you do need to import the carousel module just like we imported hello world component. Yes. Yeah, thanks for catching that. I'll update before we publish the slides. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes, so the question was, how do you differentiate between the declarations and Bootstrap? So this just because it's like the hello world example, the naming's a little bit off, but typically you're bootstrapping the app's root component, and that's typically the name you give to that component. In this case, we're just doing hello world, so it's not following the naming convention, but if you do other components in the future, you declare them. But if you're bootstrapping your app, you want to provide the root component. Yeah, great question. Any other questions? Yes, over there. So the question was, can you bootstrap multiple components? I would recommend only doing one. Yeah. Great. All right, let's move on. Okay, so as we've defined our app so far in this presentation, we have this app structure. So we have the hello world component.html, the TS file, an index file, a main.ts that handles bootstrapping, and then our app.module that kind of puts everything together and makes it available. Is that clear so far? Cool. And something cool is the CLI will help you generate this structure as well. So highly recommend checking that out whenever you're trying to build your own apps in the future. Okay, so this brings us to the end of the first section, and this is basically your homework assignment for milestone 1. So again, go through the code lab and look at the to-do sections, find everywhere there's a to-do M1, and fill it out. In this case, you will have to open up a few of the files and make some replacements. In this case, hello YouTube. Make sure you hook up the app component, then declare it, bootstrap, and then add the tags so everything renders correctly for you. Okay? All right. So again, if you have questions about this, feel free to post to the meetup, or I'm sure people will be posting on Stack Overflow later or something like that. But we'll be monitoring the meetup, so feel free to ask questions there as well as you try to work through the code lab. And of course, you will have the solutions, so you can always check against that, make sure how you're doing. Okay? Any questions on kind of this structure and the format for doing the code lab and the homework assignment? All right, amazing. Let's push on. So, secondly, we're going to talk about the new way of writing templates. So again, how many did Angular 1? Okay, and how many of you have also tried Angular 2? Okay, so a handful of you know how different it is. The rest of you are going to find out. It's very different. At first I was against it. Now I really, really like it. So let's talk about text interpolation. For those of you who've done Angular 1, this looks the same. But for the benefit of those who have never done any Angular, I'm going to go through this real quickly. So the first one just shows, hey, we have some HTML text, and we want to render in a property from a component instance, essentially. So imagine we have some person component instance, and we want to render the name property. All we do is put the 2 curly braces around it, and then Angular will automatically put in that value for you. Now, it doesn't only for properties. You can also use methods on component instances. So you can see on the second example, we're calling the getBiography method. And again, it just drops in place, very easy. The third one, this one's probably a little bit different for those of you who've done Angular 1, is that you can also use text interpolation inside of attributes on HTML elements. Again, same concept though. And then at the bottom, you can see we have some people component in which we're rendering that person component. So imagine that the top one is a person component. It has its own TS file that defines it and gives it the tag person and so forth. And then we're just rendering it there at the bottom. Any questions so far? All right, hold on to your seats. It gets crazier. So this is what the person component would actually look like. Again, we have the module ID just to make everything work with relative paths. We have our selector called person, and then we have the file person.html. The class itself has a person object of type person. Again, this is TypeScript, so we can define types. And then we just say Alice, birthday, blah, 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 all the properties and methods that we want to use for that person component. And then again, it'll just render it in place as if it was normal HTML for you, all out of the box. Any questions here? Yes?
Is that person an element or attribute?
Is this person as in on
Selector.
right here, the select?
Yes. Person, right?
Yes.
In your template.
Right, so if we go back here on the bottom bit of code, you can see there's this person right there as an HTML tag.
That's in Angular 1, it would be like an element, right?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So you're saying like declarations where you're binding it to an element or an attribute. So the way you can think about it here is it's element binding. Yeah, but components act like this. You're composing your app using like the DOM, essentially. Yeah. Oh, another type, that should be person.component.html. Thank you for catching that. I'll be sure to revisit that. Okay, any other questions? Yes, back there. So the question was, why not use a constructor to define the person in this class? You could do that. Right. This is just for the purpose of the example. Later we'll talk about dependency injection, testing, and so forth, where it's really beneficial to have the passing through constructors. Yeah. Cool. Let's move on. So let's talk about property binding one way. So again, this is different than in Angular 1. Here we have this new syntax. We have these square brackets around the property of our HTML element. So quick caveat or quick side note on the difference between property and attributes. So attributes are defined one way, but then Angular reads them in and then treats them as properties moving forward. So this is actually valid HTML, totally valid, even though you probably have never seen it outside of this context. But what this says is that we want to take the person.photo URL property from our person component instance and then put that into the SRC for the image and then render out that actual URL that might exist at that property. Okay? Is that clear so far? A little bit weird, but it makes it very clear that this is a one-way property binding expression. So what's in yellow here is what we call the template expression. So on the left side, it's what's the property binding, and on the right side, it is the template expression. So the next one we can see, there's value on an input. Again, we're just passing in the email address into the value for that input. Clear? All right, now this also works for custom components. So you saw the first two are standard HTML, image and input. But if you have some birthday card component that you define, then you can also have your own properties on that component and then bind to that. All right, clear so far? Excellent. And again, you can see at the bottom, we're just using the person component right there using the select we defined earlier. All right, so let's talk about reference binding. So you can now define in Angular 2 references or variables that point to elements in the component instances using a hash symbol. So let's look at this example and try to understand what's going on here. So you can see this input has an extra little bit on it, this reference binding, this variable, hashtag username. Now, if we want to pass that on, we can look at the next instance. So here we have, and this is a little preview, event binding with the parentheses, and saying that we want to pass the username value into some function or component called isTaken. And then that happens whenever a user clicks on that button. So you can see here, username.value, because input has a value on it. Makes sense? If you pass in just username without value, then you get the entire object. So it'd have like the value on it, then other things as well. Okay? Is this clear? All right, excellent. Yes, question? So the question was, can I repeat the difference between the square brackets and the parentheses? I will give you more than that in a moment. In 2 slides, we cover that. Yes?
Hash username is only template or in the TypeScript classes?
So the question was, is the hashtag username only available within the template, or is it also available within the TypeScript as well? So this is only in the template. So you can see here that we have the isTaken method, and then we're passing in as an argument username.value. That'll make it available to the TypeScript as well. Yeah. Cool. Right, so there's also some shortcuts that they've made available to make your life easier. So if you want to apply a certain class given some template expression, it's now really, really, really easy. So in this case, we have some class important. And again, CSS selectors have a period in front of the class names. And then if is important, which is on our component instance, value set true, then you want to show that important class. Here you can see how easy it is. Just class.important, and then if is important is true, it will then render it for you. You don't have to do this complicated logic or extra expressions to render classes conditionally now. It's all very, very easy. And if you want to do multiple types of classes like this with the shortcut property binding, you can just have another one that's class.veryImportant after it, and then use similar syntax. Cool, so this also works for other types of methods, or sorry, properties. So below you can see the style, and we're just saying we want to set the width, the CSS width of this element to some value we've defined in our TypeScript. So in this case, if is wide value to true, then we'll use the wide pixel. Let's say it's 50. Otherwise, we use narrow, which could be 20, for instance, and then that will render for you. You don't have to handle that logic yourself anymore. It's all very, very easy. You can also set attributes directly as opposed to the properties. Remember what I said earlier about Angular 2 primarily working with properties. But in this case, let's say you want to use the area disabled attribute. You can also do that by using attr dot and then whatever attribute you want to modify or bind to, excuse me. Any questions here? All right, cool. So here's the event binding that I was talking about earlier. So if you want to handle a user clicking on a button, let's look at this first example. So in this case, we have parentheses. Parentheses are how you distinguish events. Okay, or sorry, event binding. So again, square brackets are for property binding. Parentheses are for event binding. Okay? Otherwise, it looks the same. On the right-hand side, you have the template expression. So in this case, we're handling if a user clicks on this button, then we want to call the save user method. And in this case, we're passing in $event. This is built into Angular. You don't have to define it anywhere. And it just passes on that event to your TypeScript code if you want to act on it. Is that one clear? All right, so you can also define custom events. So in the second example, we have a custom component that will be called coffee maker, and we have our own event called depleted. So on depleted, we'll trigger the sound alarm method on our consuming component instance. So in this case, we're saying, oh, if there's no more coffee, we want to sound an alarm. Okay? And then the third one is another one of these shortcut event binding methods that we talked about last. Here we can see a text area. And if you want to trigger a submit, whenever the user presses Control and Enter together, now there's a very nice shortcut to make it super easy. You don't have to type in all this complicated stuff where you're checking what the keyboard input does and make sure it's like key 27 plus this. All that's done for you right here, very easy. Pretty cool, right? All right, any questions on event binding? Yes, back there. So the question was how you trigger depleted. We will talk about that later when we talk about custom event emitters, but there's a way for triggering events and passing data between parent components and children components. Yeah. Any other questions on event binding? Yes. Sorry, can you repeat? Yes, you can create custom events. We'll talk about that later. There's a whole milestone on it where you'll be implementing your own. Yeah, great. Any other questions on the template syntax? Yep.
Does that handle the case when, let's say, they're on the Mac OS?
That's a great question. I haven't tried it personally. I would think so, but don't quote me on that. We can check the docs later. I would think that they cover that, but I haven't done it personally. It's a good question, though. Oh, just to repeat the question, who's asking if on macOS, does it cover the command button as well? So if you want to do command save versus control save, depending on the OS, yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but I think they would have done that. It's a good question. Yes, back there. So the question was, can you do 2 events in the same line? So the question was, can you do 2 events on one component? So think about normal HTML and doing events, right? You can have an onBlur event and an onClick event, right, on the same element. Translates here as well. Yes? Sorry, what? JSX? I haven't tried it personally. Yeah, I can't speak to that. I do know that this is very straightforward and very readable in HTML format, so I would imagine that you could translate easily, but I haven't done it personally. Any other questions here? Yes?
Sorry, go back.
Oh, just repeating the question? Yeah.
Oh, right. So what if you
So those are 2 different types of events. So the question was, if you use Control S for one event and then keydown.control.x for another one, what would happen? And those are 2 different types of events. Yeah.
are they predefined?
The keydown ones are given for you. Yeah. All right, let's move on in the interest of time, but thank you for so many good questions. So there's also a way to do conditional displaying. So in Angular 1, we had the ngIf directive. We also have it here, but it's a little bit weird. You'll notice some other new syntax that you've probably never seen in HTML before. In this case, there's an asterisk. So here's a directive that will actually change the structure of your component tree. It will dynamically add and remove a section from your HTML and your DOM tree. And actually, that's under the hood what the star is doing for you. It's actually creating like an inline template and then conditionally showing and hiding it. But all that aside, if you want to use it the easy way, just follow this syntax. You need the asterisk followed by ngIf. Note that the I is capitalized. That is important. It is case sensitive. And then on the right-hand side, a template expression that evaluates to some truthy value. In this case, is section visible could be a Boolean, and therefore we will show howdy. Okay? This is the same use as in Angular 1 with the ngIf directive. Just looks a little bit different now when it behaves differently under the hood. It actually is more performant now, so that's cool. So something else that's very similar is the ng4 directive. So in this case, we are dynamically adding multiple things into our template. And note again, we're using the asterisks, and that this is case sensitive. So now it's asterisk ng4 with a capital F, and then some expression on the right-hand side. Now, another thing you want to note here is that we are using TypeScript, which is built on top of ES6. So we're using the new syntax, or the new keywords, in this case, let and of. And just make sure you do that. If you use in, it will not behave as you expect because the behavior has changed. Now, if you use in, you'll get the index instead of the actual object. Okay? Use let x of y. Yeah, don't use in because that's how you did in like ES5. It doesn't work the same anymore. Okay, just wanted to call that out. Yeah. So the question was, do you have to have let? Yes. Please provide let. Cool. Let's move on. All right, so now we're done with the second milestone. We talked about templates. I'm not going to talk about all these things again because I want to keep us all on time, but make sure you do milestone 2 before you do milestone 3. All right, so now how do you provide code using dependency injection to answer the gentleman in the back's question earlier? All right, so for those who aren't familiar, dependency injection is a way to provide dependencies to your code instead of hard coding them. So let's see what that looks like. So on the left-hand side, we see some code without dependency injection. in this case, we are saying provide my service. And then on the constructor here, we're just saying, hey, set my service on this component instance to a new my service instance. On the right-hand side, we're seeing that we're passing it into the constructor and then setting the instances version of service equal to what we pass in the constructor. Okay? Is this clear? That's a subtle difference, so it makes a big difference whenever you're actually writing the code in Angular and writing testable code and reusable components and so forth. All right. And just to be clear, red is bad, green is good. Use the one on the right-hand side. Use the green one, please, when you're writing your Angular 2 apps. It's not much harder, and it's much, much better whenever you're writing your code. All right, so how do we do this? Well, step one, let's make a class injectable. So in this case, we're importing injectable from the Angular core library. And then all we have to do is pass in this decorator, injectable. And then write our class, whatever we want to provide, methods, properties, etc. It all will work. Step two, provide the injectable. So we talked about ng module in the first milestone. Now we're going to go back to that, and we'll be revisiting throughout today. So you'll get really bored of me saying ng module, but here it is again. So in this case, we're declaring a unit conversion component. We haven't talked about it yet, but imagine that there's a component that we want to use it. And then we're providing the unit conversion service. So this service could be from here, for instance, okay, into our app module. So step three is consume the injectable. So we can see that we are importing the unit converter service into our unit conversion component. And I'm not going to go through and talk about all the properties on the component decorator, but in our class for unit conversion component, we can see that we are using dependency injection to get that service and make it available to our component. Does that make sense? So those are the three steps. Any questions there? And again, these things will become much more clear whenever you do the code lab. You start building it yourself and tweaking and testing out things. Yes? No? No questions. All right, great. So let's handle some services real quick. So here we're dealing with our unit conversion component. Sorry. Yes, the component. We've talked about the constructor, getting the converter, and then here we have some get unit method on our component, and whatever signature might have. Ultimately, we want to use it, right? So underneath the get unit line, we can see that we're calling this.converter.getConversion, for instance, and then handling it, right? So this is how you use the things you pass in via dependency injection. Okay? So in the constructor, you made it available, and then you're using it in the other methods. Yes, question?
Do you need the
So the question is, do you have to make it private to make it available? No, you do not. Now, it is recommended, that, depending on how you do implementations, but you can use, believe they have private, public, and protected. So just, you can check the TypeScript docs to be sure, but I think there's also protected modifier. Yeah. Cool. Let's plow on. So availability of the modules. So we talked about the modules and component trees and so forth. So something that's interesting in Angular 2 is if you provide, providers declared by a component are available to all of its children. So if you provide foo to the parent component and the parent module, then some component further down also can get it. So you don't have to redo that sort of providing and all of that. Just becomes available downstream. Just something to keep in mind as you build your apps. All right. So all done with that one. That was pretty short and easy. It's also pretty short and easy to implement on your own. Yes, question?
Can I provide the provider's array is available to all components within a particular module? If I include another third-party module, and they have some providers, would that be available in my custom module, or is it just like?
So I'll try to repeat the question because there's a lot to it. So he said that the providers you provide here. So if you provide foo, it'll be available downstream. Yes. Now, if you're consuming a third-party module, will it be available as well? Yes. So if you consume it properly, it'll be available to child components and so forth. Yeah. Yes. So the question was, could you have foo at a higher level and then another declaration of it lower down? Yes. So the question is, when would you do something like that? Ideally, you wouldn't. Hopefully, your IDE can catch it. I mean, maybe if you want to like override it, like you're changing some behavior lower down. But in that case, I'd probably just call it something else because it sounds like it'd be confusing and very error prone. Yes, one more. What if you have a child component that's not always the child of a parent? So you have to declare things in modules. So if you want a component to be available to a parent component, it has to be provided via the modules. Now you can reuse components across different modules if you'd like. It depends on how you compose your app. And I think it might become more clear when you go through the code lab. Cool. I'm going to move on. I know there's questions, but please feel free to ask on the meetup afterwards. All right, so milestone 3 done. All right, how are you feeling so far? Good. We're 1/4 through it, and we're a little bit behind schedule, so I might have to cut down on questions a little bit, but thank you for the interest. All right, so how do we compose our application now? And this is where it gets really interesting. So here we have some parent component in blue. Well, now you want multiple children underneath it. How do you make that work? Let's see if this will move. There we go. Cool. So this is really annoying and complicated because it's hard to show everything in one slide, but hopefully it's clear. Let's start on the top left. So we have our parent component. And here we can see the selector says parent, and we're providing a template with child in it. So what's child? Let's go to the right side and see the child component. So here we see the selector is child. Inside of it has an inline template that says, I'm a child. Cool. And then at the bottom, we can see our app module, and we're declaring both child and parent so that they're available. Okay? Is that clear? I could have multiple children on the left-hand side if I wanted to as well. So I could repeat child if I wanted to. Any questions so far? Apologies for the wrong input string there. It should be child.component and parent.component. Yes?
We need to always specify explicitly child. Remove it from declaration.
So the question was, if you remove child from the declarations in the app module, would it break? It would not be available. Correct. Yeah. Yes.
So in this, how do we know which is child and which is parent?
It's by the name of the class. And then you'll see the selectors are also different. Good? Not satisfied?
How does it know which one is child?
Oh, how do you know which one is which? Got it. Okay. So this doesn't quite show it. So essentially, it's how you put things in your DOM. So if on index.html you had the parent selector on there, there's the element, then inside parent in its own view template, it has child, and then it will compose the app for you. Yes, it's based on the hierarchy in which you load things on the DOM.
So right now they are essentially at the same level. But when
In the module, yes, but whenever they're rendered, they will be hierarchically put in place because of how you put them on the DOM. Yes. One more question. So the question was, are you limited to rendering it in the DOM, or can you dynamically inject them? We're doing that here. So you can have a tree of components. So imagine you have a sub-child component, and it looks similar to how you have parent and child working, right? So you can, if that's what you mean by dynamic, then yes, you can do that. Cool. I'm going to move on, but please feel free to ask me later. Move on in the interest of time. Cool. So let's talk about passing data from a parent to a child. And this is like the cornerstone of this milestone when you try to do the homework assignment. So in this case, our parent component template has child, and we have a data property binding that we're passing in the results. Well, how do we get child to see that data and then do something with it, render it, or however we want to handle it, right? So here we can see we have an input decorator called data on the child. This is how it looks conceptually. I'm going to look at code right now. Okay, here we go in code. So on the left-hand side, again, we have the parent. On the right, we have the child. Let's look first at the parent. So we can see the template we saw on the last slide. We have the child selector in there, data results, et cetera. In the parent component, we have a method called results. And it's just multiple results. And the type I don't define here, but just it could be any data that we want to pass, essentially. So that has some handler, and then you pass this data into this child data. Well, on the right-hand side, we can see that we're importing, a new decorator called input, and then we're using it near the bottom. So we have input data and it's of type results. So we're saying that we're expecting the parent to pass in an array of results, and the child can get it and then do something with it. In this case, we have a temp that's doing an ng4 and just listing out every result in that array as a new paragraph. Does this make sense? If you were first.
In the ng4 attribute, you use the syntax?
Yes, that should be let and of. I need to fix that. Thank you for catching it. Good point. All right. I think that was all the questions. Everyone had the same thought. All right, yes. So the question was, you can use component routing for parent-child relationship as well. Yes, we will get to that in milestone, I think, 11. Cool. All right, let's move on. So, quick question, yes? Yes, this is property binding. So the question was, can there be an alias? What do you mean by an alias? Right, so the data that's used on the template of the parent has to match the property on the child component instance. Yes. So data on the right-hand side has to match data on the left-hand side. Great. I'm going to move on, interest of time, because I want to get you guys a little break in the middle. All right. So now we're going to talk about handling the custom events. So now we've first talked about the property binding. We just saw that and how to pass data between components with property binding. Now it's bubble events up from children to parent. And that looks like this. This is really cool. We can see parents are communicating back and forth. Let's start at the bottom and look at the child component. Here we see a new decorator called output, and then that passes it up to the parent. So here you can see that our output is called updated, and then above we have updated as the event that we're listening to, right? So here we have parentheses to say this is an event binding on updated, and then we have some handle method on our parent component. Does that make sense conceptually? So the question was, is it like what you did in Angular 1 with emit and broadcast? More or less. Conceptually, it's, yeah, similar. And you'll see more about the event emitter and so forth in the codelab. Yeah, it works differently, but conceptually, yeah, similar. Maybe not broadcast, because it's just direct parent and child. Yeah. OK, so let's see what this looks like. And maybe the error would have helped in the last slide, too. But left-hand side parent again, right-hand side child. Here we can see the template on the parent has the child component with the updated event that we're listening for. And then you can also see on the parent component, we have the handle method that's taking an event and then just does something with it. In this case, I'm returning nothing. Now on the right-hand side, we have the child. And we can see that we're importing two new things. There's the output decorator, but there's also the event emitter. And here we can see that when we're declaring output, or sorry, we're declaring updated, we have a type of event emitter. OK, does that make sense? All right, and again, this will become much more clear when you start doing the code lab. All right, great. So here it is at a high level, the data communication between parents and child. So here you have, again, on the left-hand side, passing data down. You can think of data flowing down from parent to child. And on the right-hand side, we can think of events flowing up. So this is how we actually teach it internally. We say data flows down and events flow up. OK? Does this make sense? Yeah, there's a question? So the question was, in Angular 1, we had two-way binding out of the box for pretty much everything, right? Does this replace that? This can. There is also proper two-way data binding that we'll talk about much later, but this can work as well. You can do that same. Yeah. Cool. So the question is, how are you passing data? We'll talk about that later. It's a good question. Yeah. All right. Let's move on in the interest of time. So passing data from child to parent. So here we have another example. In this case, we're making a coffee maker component, and we have some enum at the top called brew state. Let's look at how things work near the bottom. So we have the output decorator for depleted, which is similar to the event, or the example we saw earlier, with the event emitter, with type event emitter, and coffee event. Then at the bottom, I'm just realizing that brew state is not correct. It should be coffee event. Apologies. Oh, no, that is right. My bad. So now we have the onPour method. It takes in a new state of type brew state, and then it'll emit an event here. So you can see that there's this.depleted.emit, and then we can pass in whatever data we want there. Okay. All right. We got a little tongue twisted there for a moment. Cool. Any questions? All right. Oh, yeah. Excuse me? The question was, why did I not export the class? Oops. I will update the slides. First time we're using this deck on anybody, so it's adapted from the internal version. All right, so that ends this milestone on handling custom events, okay? So again, this will make a lot more sense when you do the assignment on your own. And if you have questions on this, please feel free to reach out on the meetup group. All right, so 6. This is testing your code. Once we're done with this, we're at the halfway point, so it'll be a 5-minute break. You have to use the restroom or whatever. So let's plow through. How do you test your code? So who has written a test in JavaScript before? Okay, everyone should write tests for their JavaScript code. It's okay if you don't, but it's better if you do. It can be complicated. It's somewhat annoying sometimes. So I'm going to try to walk you through how you build a test. This is a very simple test in this slide. Nothing Angular 2 specific here. This looks like a normal Jasmine test, which is a pretty common testing framework for JavaScript. Very simply, it's like it's like many other unit testing frameworks, just slightly different syntax because callbacks and such. Here we're describing a simple test. So you can imagine we're testing a simple component, for instance. Before each sets up your component under test, for instance, or whatever you're trying to test, common setup for each thing. And then it defines the different types of tests. So typically we say it's followed by some verb and action, like what are you trying to do? So it should do X. And then you can see here we have an expect call that takes in a value, and then we expect it to equal something else. You could say expect name to equal Jane, for instance. Okay, common test. This is not Angular 2 specific. It gets weird, but we'll go very slowly, and hopefully it all makes a lot of sense. So first of all, a component under test needs to be wrapped inside of another component. So in this case, we can see that we have at the top component, and then a selector called test wrapper. The template takes in the component we're trying to test, and then we can see that we're exporting a class called person test and passing in some data right there. Okay. On the right-hand side, you can visualize what's going on here. So we have the wrapper component person test, and then inside of that, it has the person component instance. Okay. Just conceptually, that's what's going on here. All right. So let's go deeper. All right, so this one's a little bit wordy, but I will walk you through it. We'll be brave. So first, we're looking at the setup here. Most of the top you've seen before already. Just 2 things to point out. You're importing async and testbed from the Angular core testing library. So in the before each call, we're passing in async. And this is needed for compiling. Okay, everything's working asynchronously. This is a necessity for writing Angular 2 component tests. Inside of that, we have the testbed configured testing module, and this creates a special ng module for you just for testing. Inside of that, it looks like any other ng module. You can see here we have declarations, and we're passing in our person test component, which I did not import. Apologies. Or sorry, no, we have person tests. We'll get to the other thing later. Haha, I'm getting ahead of myself. So again, this looks the same as an ng module. Now, at the end of this, we can see that we're making the components available by calling testbed.compile components. Okay? Is it clear so far? So remember, before each will run before every single test. Yes, question.
The last time it says, or that's the test component, or like the person test component, or the person component?
Right. So the question is, does this make the person component accessible or the person test component? This is making the person test component available. Yeah. So if you recall back here, this is person test. Inside of it, we have person. Yeah. So then it will then make its way up. All right. So going deeper. So you'll see before each now has 3 dots because that was on the last slide, and I want this to be big and pretty and easy to read, or as much as possible. So here we have one of our test cases. So here we're saying, hey, this should contain some text. Well, first we start off by declaring our fixture. So testbed.createComponent person test. Then we're going to modify the data there. So in this case, fixture.component instance.data. And remember, this person test has a data property on it. So going back forward. And we're setting that equal to foo. Now, the next line is interesting. It's fixture.detectChanges. What this does, it'll trigger the change detection in Angular for you. So if you didn't run this, it would still be as it was before because the testing doesn't have all of the extra goodies that Angular provides for you when you're rendering it in the browser. This has to force the change detection strategy to execute. So you're calling it saying, hey, I'm ready for this to run. All right? Now, you don't have to do this manually in normal Angular land, just for tests. Now, the next line, we're declaring a test element, and this is just a shorthand for what's on the right-hand side, essentially. So the fixture.debugeElement.native element. This grabs the element and puts it into the test element. Then the last line is actually referring to the assertion. In this case, we're saying, hey, get the test element, get the text content of it, and expect it to be foo. And in this case, we'd expect this to evaluate to true. OK? Clear so far? All right. Great. So this is all of it together. It's a bit smaller. Hopefully, it's easy to read, though. Everything we talked about so far, all right here in one code snippet. Yeah? So the question was, where would dependency injection take place? What do you mean? So dependency injection is handled. So if you're trying to get like a service, for instance, onto your component, you do that when you declare your service. Now you're putting that component that might consume that service and do the dependency injection to get that service under test. And you're using the testbed testing module, right? That module to get all that data in here. So it happens under the hood for you. Yeah, question? Can you say that one more time a little bit louder, please? OK, so where is the child component provided? Got it. OK, so I don't have the ng module that sets up all this together, but essentially you provide it there. So person, test, person would be together. It would all make its way down. And remember, you're providing another module right here. OK? Cool. And again, check out the code lab. It helps make things more clear. Cool. Great questions. All right. I think, yes, that's it for the first milestone. And I'm a minute under. So we're going to go back to a little bit easier. We're going to downgrade a little bit, relax, and then it's going to get weird again. So let's revisit text interpolation. And up here, we can see a simple use in a component where we have department.annual budget. And on the bottom, we can see the rendering. And we're using the default Chrome CSS, so it's white background, blah, 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 right? So here we can see just a number rendered. But we're talking about annual budget. So what are the units? Are there cents involved? Is this USD or Japanese yen or euros? Who knows? Well, let's figure out how to make that very clear with pipes. So here we can see a change in our text interpolation expression. We're passing in a vertical bar or a pipe. And on the right-hand side, we're providing a string called currency. Now on the bottom, we can see a new rendering, which has a $ in front and then a decimal at the back. So you can see, oh, this isn't actually 1,000, blah, 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 some big number. It's actually dollars, it's $1,000, okay? So the way you can think about pipes in Angular 2 are like Unix pipes. So if you've done Angular 1, you're familiar with filters, behaves similarly. But pipes are just a new naming convention for it. It makes it easier to understand. And again, think of it like Unix pipes. All right, so how do they work? So pipes can transform any input type into any output type. The other thing is that pipes can use in any Angular binding expression. So before we saw in text interpolation, but here we're using our ng4 directive. So here we have let player of team.roster, but we want to say, hey, we only want to show the ones that are not injured. So we have some pipe called not injured, and then that will return out, instead of the full team roster, it will return only the players that are not injured. Okay, and we implement whatever logic on our own end when we define our pipe. Does that make sense? All right. So creating pipelines, again, I said you can chain multiple together. Let's see what that looks like. So here we have birthday, and it's passing in an ISO 8061 string. And we're converting it using a full date pipe. So on the second comment, you can see now it's Feb 4th, 2016, but it's title cased. So we want to convert it to all uppercase. So we pass in another pipe called uppercase, and now February is in capitalization and TH is also capitalized. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So you can also pass in arguments into your pipes. To do that, you use the colon as a delimiter. So let's see what that looks like. So we saw earlier currency, and we can assume that the default currency is USD based on that example. Well, here we're passing in CAD for Canadian dollars. Another example here is we have substring. So substring expects two parameters, right? The start and the end. And to do multiple use another colon. So you can have as many parameters as you want. Just use a colon for each one. So in this case, at the bottom, we can see that the name from Mary Ann becomes Mary. Okay? All right. So let's see how you can create a pipe. In this case, you are importing pipe and pipe transform from the Angular core library. We have the pipe decorator, and you give it a name. So in this case, substring. Go back to the previous slide. You see substring right there. So substring. So we're exporting a class called substring pipe, and we're implementing pipe transform. So it's another place where using TypeScript is beneficial because then we get some extra checking involved. So pipe transform has the signature for transform, which takes in a value. That's the left-hand side of the pipe. So if we go back here, on the bottom one, name would be the first argument. And then it can take any number of additional arguments. And again, here we can see 1 and 4. So going back to the top, we can see transform takes in a value, and then we're saying we want a start and an end number. And then it will turn out a string. And you can see the implementation there. So give you all a few seconds to digest this, and then we'll move on. Yeah. The question was, what is AY at the bottom of the interface? It should be any. I am missing an N. So the question is, does the type checking work between the TypeScript and the templates themselves? Is that what you said? I don't remember if it does yet. Whenever I first started working, it didn't. I do not recall, but I will follow up. Yeah, it's a good question. Yes?
I just bring interpolation question.
Yeah.
Does it automatically escape?
So the question was, with text interpolation, does it automatically escape HTML?
Yes.
The answer is yes. I couldn't remember, but I have a cheater, or a teacher here that can help me cheat. All right. Cool. Let's move on. Oh yeah, one more question.
Why the weird syntax for invoking a filter with a pipe with parameters? Why use the columns instead of the regular function call?
So the question is, why do we use the colons as the limiters instead of like a normal method looking thing, right? There's some history behind it. Filters look like this in Angular 1. Beyond that, it just makes it very clear that this is something different than a method call on the component instance. This is the syntax for a pipe, not for a component method. I'm going to save your question. Let's talk about it later because I want to move on to make sure we cover all the next milestones. All right, so pushing on. To consume the pipe, remember, ng module, you have to provide it in your declaration. So here we can see how we provide our pipe in the ng module, okay? All right, so there's also some built-in pipes that you do not have to define or redefine. They're there for you. Some that I find very valuable. First, JSON. You can render the JavaScript object in JSON right there. It'll display it for you. This is really great for debugging, for instance. The second one is the date pipe. This will convert a date object into another format. Now, it does more than just this. You have some simple ones like this, but you also have others that are like short date or medium date, long date, that provide some commonly used formats. You don't have to remember all the different syntaxes. Finally, there's async. So if you have a resolved value returned by a promise, you can display it here after the fact. Okay? Quickly, one question. Does it work with observables as well? I believe yes. Yeah, it should. Cool. And if you want to learn more about which other ones are built in, just go to the docs online. Again, I'll provide the deck after the fact, and this should do the direct link to the built-in types or built-in pipes for you. Cool. So milestone 7 again. I will not go over it, but this will help reinforce the learnings. One important thing here is that we're asking you to convert like a long date string into something that's human readable, like 1 year ago or 2 years ago. You don't have to make it amazing. You can import moment and make it very detailed and nice, but you also make it kind of crappy and just at the year, month, or day level. Don't worry about making the actual logic perfect. Just make sure that the pipe works. The intent here is to learn pipes, not making the best humanized date pipe. Okay? Cool. Let's move on to the next milestone. So projecting content into your components. Things are going to get a little bit complicated, so bear with me. I expect lots of questions, so don't worry. So let's talk about the difference between a content and a view for a component. So imagine we have some component called picture frame. We can see the template on the left side. And on the right-hand side, that's what it looks like. It just renders some simple box with a brown border. By itself, picture frames are not interesting, right? Who buys a picture frame and just leaves it there without anything on the back? Nobody. Okay. So let's talk about what this is first and then talk about putting in something. So this is called the view. Again, this is the picture frame without anything in it right now. Okay, this is the component view. All right, so let's make it interesting. Let's add in our dog. This dog is named Lucky, it seems. The dog is now inside the picture frame. You can see that the image tag is inside the picture frame, right? Okay, so again, we have view, which is the picture frame. This dog, this image tag, is the content. All right, so I'm making very slow and deliberate and clear, but this is a really important concept that can be confusing later on if you don't understand this concept. All right, so picture frame view, and then the content goes inside of it. Any questions here so far? Amazing. Okay, so again, for the picture frame component, the frame is rendered, or the frame rendered is the component view, and the photo is the content. Okay. All right, so let's see what this looks like. Here we have our component called picture frame. The template has a div with class photo. That class gives us the brown border, let's say. And then inside of that, we have this ng content directive. And this might be familiar for some of you who have done Angular 1 with transclusion and so forth. So this ng content says anything that shows up inside of my component instantiation will render in here in my template view. Okay? Any questions here? All right. So let's talk about having multiple contents in our view. So here on the left-hand side, we see we've added a new element. We've added a paragraph with the class name. And okay, yeah, the dog's named Lucky for sure. And it renders on the right-hand side with this little red border on the bottom. Okay, well, how do we know how to differentiate between the two pieces of content? There's the image and the P. Well, we have here what we call content, and we're saying this is the image. And then we have another piece of content with name. And you'll notice that there's a dot in front of it in the parentheses at the bottom. This is because we're using CSS selectors. So image img is a CSS selector, and dot name is a CSS selector because we have class equal to name. Okay? Is this bit clear? Any questions? It's OK. Awesome. All right. So let's see what this looks like when we try to build our picture frame component. So on the right-hand side, we can see that we have the picture frame being used. And on the left-hand side, we have two ng content directives now. And you'll notice that there's this extra thing, select. So in this case, we're saying when we find image in our content of our component, then render it on the top. Otherwise, if we have the .name found, then do it on the bottom. OK? The other thing I want to point out here is we can see that this works not just for static HTML, but also for data binding and text interpolation and so forth. So I've modified it slightly. So instead of hard coding Lucky and the dog's image URL, which was lucky.png, I'm now using data binding and text interpolation. It all still works. Is this clear? Yes, question. So the question is, can you use asterisks in the select to select everything? So if you don't provide any selector, that's the default behavior. Yeah. Yes, question.
So, why would you use ng content in having the image in the paragraph tag right there between the divs?
So the question is, why would you do this at all, essentially? So think about reusable components. Maybe this doesn't matter for your app in particular, but maybe you're using someone else's app. They provided something for free online that you can use, and you want to consume it and put your own content in. Maybe they have a very fancy bit of CSS that you don't have to re-implement. They provide it as a component for you. OK, I'll use your picture frame component and then put in my own pictures that I get from my code. Make sense? Cool. All right, so that's it for projecting content into your components. Is there anything I can clarify here? We will go deeper into this on the next milestone, but I want to make sure that's very, very clear before we do. Are there any more questions here? Yes. How do you do what? How do you supply the dog? So you mean here? Oh, OK. So the question is, where is dog.image URL? So if we have the myPhotos component, you can see here it's myPhotos component.html. There would be a corresponding myPhotos component.ts, which would be the TypeScript code. So that component's instance, the myPhotos component instance, would have a dog property on it, and then that would have image URL. OK? Same thing with dog.name. Good question. 1 second. Yes.
If you don't have a select on the second.
So the question is, if you do not put the second ng content with the select for .name, will it render?
If you don't put the select, so you just have ng content.
Oh, so if you just, OK, so to repeat the question properly, if you have the second ng content without the select, what will happen, right? I encourage you to try it on your own on the codelab, because you'll have the opportunity to do it. It's one of those things where you can experiment and see. And that's actually what I tell people internally, too. It's one of those fun experimentations. OK, yes, one more question in the back. So the question is, can you nest ng content? No, you shouldn't. Yeah. Yes.
Should number of ng content elements match with number of nested inside?
So the question is, should the number of ng directives on the left-hand side match the number of elements on the right-hand side? And technically, it's not a requirement. It is highly advised. It makes it much easier. You're less likely to have errors and so forth. Yeah. Cool. Let's push on. So any other questions? Going once? OK. So let's talk about how you can couple your components tightly. And we're going to build on top of the idea of views and content. So just to recap, what's the difference between loose and tight coupling? Loose coupling is good for reusable, isolated components. You're using someone else's components and using it in your own app, like the material library, for instance. You can use input and output to pass data back and forth. And then you can use template syntaxes, which we just saw. Now, tight coupling is a bit different. You want to use tight coupling for components that work together. This also offers stronger type safety. And to build it in Angular 2, you want to use constructor injection, and then these new decorators called content children and view children. And again, content and view we just covered in the last milestone, so this builds on top of that concept. And as you can imagine, we're talking about type coupling. Okay. So let's start with an example to understand what I mean by this. So on the right-hand side, you can see a normal design pattern we see on the web, tabs. On the top, you have a header with the tab names that you can click on. In the middle, you have the content of that tab. So you click on tab 1, you get tab 1 content. If you click on tab 2, you get tab 2's content, and so forth. And then on the bottom, we have some fun footer that just says, hey, you're on tab 1 of 3 in case the CSS that shows a different color at the top doesn't give it away for you. Okay? So now on the left-hand side, student code, we have some tab group. We have a custom component called tab group. Inside of that, we have content tab, right? So we have 3 tabs there. In the tab group component, which you see at the bottom, which is what defines the template for the tab group that we see at the top, we can see there's a header, then ng content, then footer. So far, it should make sense given the last milestone, but just to be sure, any questions? A lot of people get tripped up here, so it's totally okay. All right, awesome. So again, this is what it will look like. So we have the header, the ng content, and then the footer, okay? And that comes from the tab group component on the bottom. Everyone's good? I'm intentionally going very slow here. All right. So let's look at this a little bit more deeply. On the right-hand side, we can see the structure. The green ones, the green circles are content children, and the blue ones are view children. So using the same definition we saw on the last slide, let's go through and just draw this out conceptually. So tab group is our orange circle. It's our parent, okay? Tabs are the green. They go underneath our tab group component. And then header and footer also go underneath it, okay? But remember, there's a distinction. The green ones are content children. The blue ones are view children. And as we saw in the last milestone, there is a difference between the component's view and the component's content. This clear so far? This is probably the most confusing section of today. So it's okay if there are questions. Anybody? All right, the slide was a winner. Cool. So let's move on. So let's talk about how we can inject a parent component. So let's just dive into it. We have our component. We have a selector called tab. We have our template for the tab called tab component.html. And the tab component wants to get the tab group, its parent, right? So you can see in the constructor using dependency injection to get the tab group component. Let it sink in for a second. Does this make sense, everybody? We're just grabbing the tab group component. Forget the why for now. Just what we're doing is getting the parent, the tab group, in the tab. Good? Everyone's good? All right, let's push on. So let's go the other direction. Now we're looking at the tab group component. We want to get its children. This one's a little bit more complicated. So I'll ignore the imports for now and just talk about what's going on in the tab group component class near the bottom. So we can see we have this new decorator, content children, and it's taking in tab components. So we're expecting content children of tab components, right? If you remember back here, the tab group has multiple tab children. Does this make sense? Going back again, tab component, right? And then we're passing in a list of tabs. Now you can't just use a normal array. Because things can be created dynamically in Angular 2, we have this special type called query list. And we're passing in tag components. We're saying, hey, we want a query list of all the tab components. And what this does is monitors for any changes. So if you add new tab components dynamically, for instance, it'll always be up to date. Okay, so it's getting all the tab components and putting it into our tabs property on the component instance. Similarly, at the bottom, we see view children, and it's expecting input component, for instance, just some extra one that I created. Doesn't really relate to the tab example we were seeing. But you can see, again, we're using the query list to get all the input components and make them available to our component instance. Okay, Now, one important thing to keep in mind is, since most of you are going to be transpiling down to ES5 and not ES6, you need to use toArray on the query list. And this will make it something that you can iterate on in your TypeScript code. Because again, it transpiles down to ES5, and that's just a necessity to make it work. Okay, so if you're getting bugs whenever you're doing the code lab and trying to solve it, make sure you include that, because that's a common error we see internally. All right? Any questions here? Yes?
The tab component, you injected tab group component. Is that required for the content children to work?
So the question is, I'm going to try to repeat it, that in this slide, we are using dependency injection to get the group component, and on this one, we aren't? Is that required for it to work?
Yeah, so you have content children and you have tab components. Does the content children require tab component to have the parent?
Okay, so the question is, do we have to have the parent injected in the child component for this to work here? No. Yeah, this is just showing how you can put the two together. Now, in tab groups, you would want to make sure that there's some sort of negotiation happening, make sure you're not showing two tabs at once, which is why it would matter. But yeah, it's not a hard requirement just for doing query lists, for instance. Yeah. All right, so let's do a more simple example now that the query list one's done, because surprisingly, everybody got that right away, which I'm really happy about. So now let's talk about getting a single child, a single content child or a single view child. If you understood the last one, this should be super clear, but we have a different decorator, content child, and a different decorator for view child, but it behaves much the same way. The only difference is on the right-hand side, you don't have the query list. Now, this is great because if you always expect to have just one child, it makes it very clear what's happening. The difference is it doesn't work so with dynamic things. So if you want to add an additional child component, for instance, or additional content child, for instance, excuse me, then this will no longer work. It'll just grab the first one it finds, right? So if you expect to have dynamically changing children, then make sure that you're using what we saw on the last slide with the query list and view children or content children, okay? But if you have a very simple, tightly coupled set of components, this is awesome. Any questions here? All right, cool. So that's it for this milestone. Are there really no questions? I'm actually shocked. Yes, okay, in the back. So the question is, could you have different types of content children, for instance? So instead of having coffee pot component alone, you could also have another content child with a different type of component. Yes. Great question. And again, the TypeScript that we're using here makes it much more clear what's going on. So we can see, let's go back to the previous slide. This first directive, the content children directive, we're looking for a query list of all tab components, right? So you could have other content children, for instance, but you know that tabs is only getting tab component. So TypeScript makes it very clear what's going on. Yes, question.
These two components, are they on purpose named tabs, both the same name?
No, tabs, the second one should not be named tabs, it should be called inputs. Thank you for catching that. Again, I will update the deck before we mail it out. Yes, question.
So if I have to create a module, should I declare both the components in one?
So the question is, if you're defining this in ng module, essentially, should you declare both? Yes. So you'd actually want to declare, you want to make sure everything's available. So tab component, input component should both be available in that module. Yeah. Cool. Good questions. Yes, one more.
Component is for that header and
No, it's just some other view child that I created here. Yeah. Header and footer wouldn't really, I mean, you could do it. I probably should have done it. Yeah, it's a good question. But it could be any other type of view children. Just remember, it's on the component's view, not the component's children. That's the main distinction that trips people up sometimes. Yeah, it's a good question. Cool. All right, great. Well, we are right on time. Let's push forward. So the last three are a lot easier and they feel like you're building a real app. So let's talk about lifecycle hooks. To do that, we're going to start with an example. So let's imagine at the top we have this use of the shoe picker component. And we can see that there is what? What is heel style? What type of binding is that? One way, yes. What else? Property binding, thank you. Right-hand side, we have the template expression, and we're passing in filter.heel. Well, let's see what it looks like. So we have on the bottom the shoe picker component, and we have an input, which we've seen before. We're expecting a string to come in. And in the constructor, we're just doing like some debugging. Let's say like, hey, let's print out of the console the heel style, right? What do you think is going to happen? I'm somewhat giving it away because the obvious answer can't possibly be right. Otherwise, why would I be asking you at all? This will not work. The component instance is created before the inputs are updated with the bound values, okay? Well, I still have this use case. I want to print this to the console really badly. How do I make it work? So there is a lifecycle hook you can take advantage of. So you can see the code changed slightly. We're now importing this on init from Angular Core's library. And then the class, which needs to be exported, excuse me, implements on init. And then we can see instead of using constructor to print this out to the console, we have this ng on init. And something to point out here is we have this ng prefix to make sure that we don't collide with other methods you might have. Okay, so this one's by Angular. When you do it this way, everything works as expected because now the component has been instantiated and the bound values are available as well. Any questions on that little bit? So he let me know that I spelled heel style wrong on the input near the bottom. That is definitely correct. That's not right. It's right everywhere else in that file, though. There's a question back there. Yes. So the question is, how do I do more than one hook? So I'm going to talk about all the hooks in a moment, but you can see that we have implement on init, and then there's an on init method that we have here, the ng on init method, excuse me. Just keep doing that for the other lifecycle hooks. So if you have other lifecycle hooks you want to take advantage of for this component, you can do so. So that leads me to the next slide, which is what are available? What are the lifecycle hooks that we have? So we talked about on init, but just to give you the textbook definition, this is called when Angular has finished initializing the component. This is very useful for reading initial bound values. Okay, we just saw that in this last example. So the complete opposite side of the spectrum is on destroy, which you may be familiar with in general, but this is called when Angular is destroying the component. So you can use this for any cleanup before the component is fully destroyed and removed from your app. Something interesting to note here is these are both called with those asterisk directives. So you saw earlier ngIf and ng-for. Whenever you add or remove the components using that, these both get called. Okay, so if you have children components, based on that, this will happen. Okay? All right. So a few others. On changes, this is called after every change to input properties and before processing any content or view childs. We'll talk about that in a moment. This will pass in a map of all the changed values. Okay? The next one that works kind of hand in hand is do check. This is called every time input properties are checked for changes. Now, you can use this to replace Angular's built-in change detection with your own checks. You may not use this very often, and you can break things pretty easily with this, but it does give you some power. A good example is maybe you don't want to check below a certain point. You say, hey, everything below we know is going to be static. Don't check those for optimization purposes. So you can override the change detection strategy if you want to. And on the docs online, there's some built-in helpers to make certain common overrides more easier. Excuse me. All right. So let's talk about the content and view children now. So we have the after content in it for when which is being called after the component is initialized. Similarly, we have one for the view. And then we also have lifecycle hooks after they're checked. So after the content is checked and after the view of the component is checked. Okay? Any questions here? All right, so the whole lifecycle hook order, you think what we just talked about flows like this. So On changes gets called first, then on init, then do check, then after content init, then after content checked, then after view init, then after view checked, and then finally on destroy. Okay, so if you're trying to use multiple of these and trying to understand how things actually work, this is the order in which they occur. Great. So something else that's interesting is, well, now it's initialized, what happens? So what happens after that first check? So we still get the on changes on every pass. We get the do check, we get the after content checked, and the after view checked. We don't have inits, obviously, because they've already been done whenever the code was first initialized. And then destroy only happens when you destroy it, so I won't include it here. But there is that escape route as well from that loop. Okay? All right. So quick aside on directives versus components. I've mentioned directives a few times today. Just want to go in a little bit more detail what that is, because this is important for the first time when you do the code lab assignment. So directives in Angular 2 are a super class of component. In fact, a component is a special type of directive that has a template associated with it. You can also control directives using HTML. So we saw earlier like ng content, right? That is a type of directive. It doesn't have its own template. It instead has some extra behavior that then will do whatever you want it to do. Okay, so you'll be using directives when you do the code lab here. All right? One more. So another thing to talk about is change detection. So Angular's change detection traverses the componentry top to bottom, aka depth first traversal. Once a component is checked, its values cannot be changed, or sorry, cannot be updated again in the same cycle. So it has to go from the top all the way to every leaf and then back to the top before you can do the checking again. Okay, something important to keep in mind. Now, if you try to update a component within the same cycle, Angular will throw an error in dev mode so that you say, oh, I know there's an issue. I'll correct it before I deploy to prod. Okay? All right. Any other questions on lifecycle hooks? Yeah.
Between a constructor, which one we should use?
So the question is, between a constructor and ng on it is a recommendation for which one you should use. So you use each one differently. So constructor is great for dependency injection, right? But if you want to read bound values, for instance, you need to use ng on init. Okay? Cool. Any other questions? Yeah. The question is, could you use both together? So could you have a constructor as well as ng on init? Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Could you say a little bit louder, please? Is it called on browser close? No, because you're closing the browser, so the components is kind of, it all gets removed from your memory anyways, right? So yeah, it doesn't get called on like the window closing, for instance. Yeah. So if the idea is like you want to execute something on like your API or something like that, saying, oh, this was removed, that wouldn't work. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Thank you. Yes.
How do I ensure that I don't do?
So to make sure you don't update something within the same cycle, well, one of the great things is that you'll get an error and it'll just tell you, hey, you can't do that. Yeah. And to be fair, if you're using the default change detection strategy, it shouldn't pop up at all. It's only when you try to override it with your own behavior that it'll happen. But this is, so far in my teachings, not commonly used. You may have use cases for it, obviously, and that's why there's support for it, but it's not super common. Yeah. Yes. One more time louder, please. Can you have custom lifecycle hooks? No. Yes? Yes?
Well, there's just methods that are called.
I guess that's true. All right, so they're just methods that are called, so technically yes. But the ones that are built into Angular are there. Does that make sense? So the question is, can you put a hook in between the ones that are provided by Angular? So the answer from our pro over here is if you call them at the right time, but it gets tricky. I'm curious about your use case, so we can chat afterwards and figure out what might be the best way. But yeah, it's hard to recommend it because it might be very complicated and error prone. Yeah, cool. These are great questions. Yes. The question is, can you extend the functionality? Like, what do you have in mind? Right, so that's what they're giving for you, right? So you have blah, 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 blah. Yeah, on init. So you're saying, I want to do something. By default, on init will not print to the console, right? But now you're saying, I want to print something to the console. So that is your way of doing something custom on these lifecycle events. Cool. All right, so we have 15 minutes left and 2 more milestones. So I'm going to cut the questions there, but feel free to find me afterwards or post to the meetup. So let's create an app with routes. Most apps have more than one page, right? So let's figure out how we build it. So here's the typical layout that you might have seen 10 years ago. This looks awesome for 10 years ago. So on the right-hand side, we can see the template as rendered. And on the left-hand side, we're going to see how we define our app. So in this case, we have our foobar app. And you can see here that the top, the index, and the other links, and then we have the main content of our page. Well, how does that translate to the left side? On the left, we have the H1 with class logo, foobar Inc. That gives you the yellow section. The router links will render in the blue section. That gives you an index link. It's an anchor tag, so you can actually do routing. And then the last bit is the router outlet directive, which will let you load whatever route data in that red section. Okay? Does what's going on here make sense? Yeah? Yes? Kind of? All right, let's look a little bit deeper. So let's define our routes and make sure we understand what's going on under the hood. So we're importing the router module and routes from the Angular router library. We're defining here routes of type routes. Sounds a little bit confusing reading it out loud, but it should make sense when you see it with color coding. So the first the first route we have is a path with no extra data or no extra strings. So this is the root, so just slash essentially, right? This will have the index component. Okay, this is a easy way to think about it. The second path we have is search, and this will have the search component. So if a user goes to myapp.com/search, it'll take them to that same page that we saw before, but with the search content rendered in that red section, that router outlet. The last one's interesting that might be useful for many of you. This is a redirection. So we have, let's say a user goes to /index, and we're like, oh, /index is ugly. You can go to just /, that's the root. It makes more sense. So we can say redirect to root and then just do a path match full. So anytime somebody says index, go back to the root, okay? The last bit there is we're declaring a new module here. So router module.forRootRoutes. And what forRoot does is it creates a module that contains the directives, the routes, and the router service itself for you, okay? You can also have children routes. So you can imagine search having sub-routes for it. And for that, you use forChild. So forChild will create a module that has the directives and the routes, but not the route service itself, okay? Yes, there was a question back there? So the question is, can you use an asterisk to catch all other paths? I don't remember. It'll be on the docs, though. Yeah, I really can't remember right now. Cool. One other question?
Is the router outlet view outlet?
So the question is the router outlet a view outlet? So the router outlet's a special type of directive. It's not.
Okay.
Yeah.
So where would the content be when you let's say you go to search, right? Click on it.
Sure. So the question is, what happens if you click on search? So by default, we're on the index page. We saw the route defined on the next slide. If you click on search, you'll still be on, like, conceptually, like the index file, but the search code or the search HTML will render in the red section. And if you click on index again, it goes back to what you see right now.
Let's say I add another link in about, and how do I specify?
So the question is, let's say that there's another component called about. And how do you specify that to show up here? So you'd have another anchor tag with a router link directive with about. then you'd have another path, or sorry, another route here with path about, and component would be about component, for instance. Okay, and the about component has its own template, right? Because it's a component. Components have to have templates, and then that's what we'll load in there.
Yeah, where would it go? Where would you, element?
So the router outlet directive is what provides that functionality.
Okay, so that would show up in the router outlet.
Yes.
Can we have multiple router outlets?
Yep, we have multiple router outlets, right? Oh, sorry, router outlets, sorry. Yes, it's a bit complicated, but you can experiment with that to see how you'd want to do it. Yeah. All right, and then as always, one second, remember to update your ng module. So in this case, we have now the app routes module that we defined in the last slide, and we are importing it into our app module. Okay? Yes, there was a question?
Yeah, can you just describe why we would use routes instead of
So the question is, why would I use routes instead of tabs? For very simple examples like this one, yeah, they're technically interchangeable. Although I'd say in this case, the router is much easier than declaring all of the extra view children and component and content children and so forth. But in practice, you might want a tab group and tabs for like a dashboard, but then that might not be the only page in your app, right? You might have multiple other things, and for that, you'd want router links. Okay? Oh, there's another good point. So router links also work for like bookmarking. You get history, so using the back button, forward button, those all work as well. Tabs may not have that implemented unless you put it in. Yes. Okay, a few typos. Thank you. Yes. So is the router outlet a replacement for ngView? Yes, this is the new router for Angular 2. This is similar to ng route in Angular 1. But instead of using ngView, we have router outlet. Yeah, cool. 10 minutes left, so sorry, no more questions on this section, please. But quick recap, you have to have the router outlet directive, the router link directives, and a router module with the configuration for routing to work in Angular 2. Okay, and I will save some time at the end to chat with you if you have more questions about this. All right, so in Milestone, you will be implementing routing. And if you remember from the demo earlier, there's the default search router outlet, or sorry, the search route, and then you'll also add an upload route with just placeholder text. Okay. So finally, how to handle user data with forms. So on the left-hand side, you can see a Angular 2 form. And for the most part, it looks like something you normally see in normal HTML, but there's this extra directive called ngModel. So username and email have this ngModel directive. Then we have a div called ngModel group that we say is an address. And then we see again within that ngModel. Well, what's happening is that Angular is creating a form object for you, so it's very easy to understand what's going on in the template and then use it in your component instance. So here you can see the form object on the right side, and it just follows that same structure we had on the left when we declared our form. So username, email, address, inside of that, there's another object with street and zip. Is that clear? Awesome. Makes it really easy to work with forms. So let's talk about one-way versus two-way data binding to answer a question from much earlier today. So first we have a one-way data binding with just username and ngModel, right? That's easy. Well, two-way binding, as we talked about earlier, you could use the property binding and the event binding to make two-way binding work, and that's where you can see it. But there's a shorthand to make it even easier and clear whenever you're writing your templates, and that's with this square bracket on the outside and a parenthesis on the inside. Internally, we call it banana in a box. So if you think about the square brackets as being a box and you have bananas inside of it, that's how you make sure you get the right order. If you have parentheses on the outside, it actually won't work. So do it this way, but this will give you the two-way data binding. And for those of you who don't know, what this means is if a user types, the username in this input element, it'll run back to the template, or sorry, to the component instance. But then you can also send data from the component instance back to the template so that the user can see the change. Is this clear? Okay, great. All right, so let's talk about accessing the form. So we saw the form object earlier, and I'm not going to repeat all of the code for the form there, but imagine the three dots has everything we saw earlier. On the right-hand side, we have our register component, and we want to get that data, right? So inside of this, we can see we have a view child, and it's looking for an ng form. We can see we imported ng form from the Angular forms library at the top. So it's of type ng form. That just gives us the register form. That gives us that object. It's now available, and we can use everything we see on the right-hand side here using the register form property on our component instance. Okay? Yes, question? So the question is, are all forms by default ng forms? Yes. But to access them, you have to do it this way. And to be very clear, if you want that nice form object, you have to use the ng model directives here as well. Nested forms was the question. Let's get to that. Well, it's not quite nested, it's multiple forms, but hopefully it'll answer your question. So before we get there, let's first talk about accessing forms by name. So here we can see something we saw earlier with the hashtag. We're creating a reference binding here called register form. And we're saying it's an ng form, right? What this gives us is a way to use it elsewhere in our template. So in this case, a common design pattern we see is, oh, send an error saying that the form's invalid if something's not working. So in this case, we can say, oh, ng if the register form is valid, let it go. But if it's not valid, as you can see with the exclamation mark in the front, display that it's invalid, okay? On the right-hand side, you'll see the syntax change slightly. Now the view child's looking for a register form string, which we can see defined on the left-hand side. Otherwise, the register component looks the same. Is this clear? All right. So we can also, oh, sorry, just going back to the other question. I thought I had a slide here, but I didn't. To have multiple forms, just name them. Now, I think it's better design practice to not have multiple forms per component. Instead, put one form per component, then render multiple components. But technically, if you want to have multiple forms in one component, just name them, and then you can access them individually in your component instance. Yeah. Yes, question? The question is, what about the selector? So the question is, register form, where are we calling that? So keep in mind, this is the component, the register component. This is the HTML template for the register component. Now, elsewhere in, for instance, index.html, you might have the register, or myapp.html, whatever. You could be using the component there, and you'd call register form there, right? This is the full component definition right here. No, so register form that you see on the left-hand side with the camel case and the hashtag is not at all referencing the selector with the register dash form in the component selector. Yeah, that's two separate concepts. All right, let's finish up because I want to make sure people get out of here on time. Custom validators. So HTML5 validators work out of the box. So we can see here in the first line, we have the ng model, and then required, which is from HTML5, and Angular will handle that for you. It's free and it's nice and easy. But you can also make custom validators. So we can see in the second input element, we have a validated email directive and lets you do more complex validation. Let's see what that looks like. So this is a little bit gnarly looking, but it's not too bad. Let's go through it. So first we can see we have a directive decorator at the top, and we provide a selector. So this is a CSS selector. So in this case, we're saying, hey, look for input elements that have a validated email directive on it and also ng model. If we go back a slide, we can see the second one matches that exactly. Oh, it's an input element with ng model and validated email, right? Okay, so we have the selector taken care of. Well, let's look at this providers thing. So what we're saying here is that there's a list of ng validators that are provided by Angular, but we also want to add our own. So what's happening here is providing ng validators. We're saying, hey, we want to use our own function called emailvalidator.emailCheck, and then multi-true saying we want to add this to the existing list. Don't replace it all with just our one. We want all the other ones there as well. Okay. Then in the class, we can see we have a static method. This is just to make it nicer. It could be a function defined at the top level as well, and it has a signature that's important. So we can see we have this email check function, and it takes in a control, a form control, and then the output is a map of errors So in this case, we can see here that after some validation, we're returning, oh, there's a bad email error, and the message when it's sent to the UI is the email address was invalid. Okay? This clear so far? Excellent. 1 second, we get to the last 2 minutes, and then I'll answer your question. Oh, I'm done. Awesome. So I'll answer your question now. So the question is, this gentleman has been doing his own custom validators for a little while now, trying to make it work. And if he would enter in a wrong or an invalid value and then change it to be something value, it wouldn't correct, right? And he's asking if this would fix that. This should handle that behavior for you, yes. I don't know how you were implementing it, so I can't speak exactly to what was going on. But if you post like Stack Overflow or the Meetup group or something, I'm sure we can take a look at it. Cool. So we're right at time, so I think let's just push on real fast, and then if there are questions at the end, feel free to reach out. But again, we are done. I know that was a lot of content. Thank you. This was a lot of content. This is actually very hard stuff. I highly expect you guys to go back and revisit these slides a few times or watch the video later. Again, this is what we teach internally. There's a few minor tweaks, but overall, this is what other people at Google see and experience. So you got that experience, which is awesome. Again, just like in school, just sitting and listening to a lecture is not enough. So go do the homework, reinforce the concepts, make sure you understand it. There is the solution right there. It just takes what you did in the codelab and takes it all the way to the end. All the milestones are completed. And if you have questions, again, just feel free to post to the Meetup group or elsewhere on the internet.